So you want to build a pure spellcaster, the kind where you will never swing a weapon once the entire playthrough. Strangely, a lot of people say this playstyle is easy mode, and then they show you the same clip of Moog getting blasted by Comet Azur 8 million times, but what they actually mean to say is having summons or spirit ashes distract the boss while you freely pelt them with spells is easy. Which, I mean, no shit, of course that is. However, if you've ever tried to solo an agile boss with a pure spellcaster, you undoubtedly know the struggle and how difficult it can be. All that being said, pure spellcasting is without a doubt my favorite type of build, and has been since Elden Ring came out. You think a build is diverse if it has 1 or 2 or even 3 weapons, but pure spellcasters have 10 weapons equipped at all times. Although there are a few brain-dead strategies, pure casters have one of the highest skill caps out of any build in the game, and once you get really good at swapping through your spells and casting without even looking, it just feels awesome. As a quick aside, this is a guide for pure sorcery as in intelligence casting with a staff. Now, you can technically make pure faith incantations work, and I've done it, but it is significantly more tedious and basically amounts to you casting Catch Flame 4,000 times for half the game, so you can do it, I just wouldn't really recommend it. So, let's get right into it. First, pick Astrologer. This one is a no-brainer, as it is the clear sorcery-based class and even comes equipped with a couple of spells and a staff right out of the gate. Go to the Grafted Scion, realize that you physically do not have enough FP to kill it without any flasks, and just end yourself. Next, go through the standard new character shenanigans in Elden Ring. This game's 2 years old at this point now, so I'm not going to make a guide on how to get Torrent to where the Wondrous Physick is, but if you need this information, Professor Google will definitely help you immediately. Now, this is a guide specifically on making a pure spellcaster and that whole process. Do note that you should prioritize going to the Weeping Peninsula first to collect the 3 free sacred tears from the churches there, and pay attention to nearby Golden Seed locations. Flasks are immensely important to a character who literally cannot attack without FP, so prioritize getting flask upgrades almost more than anything else you do. As for flask allocation, I typically have a 1-to-1 ratio for health and FP specifically. When you're maxed out, I think 8 healing and 6 mana regen are probably the best choices. So if you have 6 flasks total, for example, have 3 healing and 3 FP flasks. This does mean you can't afford to take as much damage as other builds, but you can also damage things from safer places, so it kind of ends up evening out most of the time. First things first, you need your bread and butter spell known as Carian Slicer. Carian Slicer is your default spell because it is incredibly FP efficient, only costing 4 FP per swing, while still doing the damage of a small greatsword. It is incredibly versatile and can be used while running, jumping, and even after rolling. This is essentially your melee weapon for the entire playthrough, and you will never stop using it. Carian Slicer has only one downside in that it does virtually no stance damage, meaning you're never gonna stagger a boss with it. However, it does at least stun lightly armored enemies. Now, we get Carian Slicer from the Royal Academy scroll, which is conveniently right nearby in Limgrave, right here. Just grab it and bolt there. Next, we need to take the scroll to a Sorcery Teacher. We're going to use Selin as our teacher because she is hot. Selin is located right here. Unfortunately, there is a low-level Pumpkinhead mini-boss guarding her. So, this is honestly one of the hardest parts about the run right here. You have to sort of hug his ass and cast Glintstone Pebble when he is not facing you to avoid auto-casting to his helmet, which takes very little damage. After you do that, give the scroll to Selin and finally learn Carian Slicer. Always have Carian Slicer in your first spell slot. The reason is, you can hold up on your D-pad and this will automatically go back to your first spell. Considering Carian Slicer is your bread and butter that can swing almost immediately, being able to switch to your fastest weapon as soon as possible is pretty vital. Now that we have Carian Slicer, we require a casting tool to use it. Luckily, the Meteorite staff is extremely easy to get and requires killing nothing. Just head over to Caelid and go to the swap by Vaonia. It's just sort of sitting in some runes here, guarded by some flowers. Now, the Meteorite staff is going to be used for almost half of the entire playthrough, and it is awesome to level with because it can't be upgraded. But it has the relative sorcery scaling of a half-upgraded staff already. That means all you have to do is worry about levels. 0 smithing stones are required for a really long time. Additionally, right next to the Meteorite staff is Rock Sling, one of the only sorceries in the game that deals physical damage. We'll need this for a few fights like Renala and Adula, the dragon involved with Ranni's questline, as both are extremely resistant to magic damage. Unlike Carian Slicer, Rock Sling does a very high amount of stance damage, usually staggering even dragons with 3 casts to the head. It is very useful against large, slow-moving bosses, and not so useful against small, agile ones. For now, though, you have your perfect starter kit. Level Vigor and Intelligence with a bit of Mind thrown in. It might seem tempting to get more Mind to get more FP, but with more Intelligence, you kill things faster, and with less casts, meaning you need less FP. This setup will take you through a large portion of the game alone. But for spells, you do want to get more than just Rock Sling and Carian Slicer. So let's go over some spells that you can get early into the game that you will actually use for your entire playthrough. Carian Piercer is a personal favorite of mine. Found from a Teardrop Scarab in Carian Manor, it is a short, medium-range magic stab that staggers most foes. While it boasts pretty good damage, the real draw to Carian Piercer is the fully charged version. By holding the cast button down, the magical blade goes even further and knocks down all small enemies. This allows you to essentially permanently stunlock all human-sized enemies and completely trivializes these fights. Extremely useful. Swift Glintstone Shard is an extremely boring, unimpressive tiny little magic dart received from trading the Academy Scroll to any sorcery vendor. This scroll is found after Godric and Liurnia in a small graveyard to the west. However, this little thing has so many uses, whether it's picking off a distant foe with a tiny amount of health, or getting random chip damage in between boss combos when you're not in melee range for Slicer. The damage of Swift Glintstone Shard adds up over any prolonged fight. Seriously, if you learn to weave it in between combos and record a boss fight, you'll see the thousands of damage it eventually ends up doing. Like Carian Slicer, it can be used while jumping, running, and after rolling. Use it pretty much like a ranged version of Carian Slicer when necessary when you're not in range, but you're open for some damage there. Adula's Moonblade is a great short to medium range spell that conjures a frozen greatsword in your hand. It's dropped by the dragon of the same name outside of the church where Ranni's questline ends. This spell can also be chain cast, meaning multiple casts will flow smoothly into each other. Now, unlike Carian Greatsword, Adula's Moonblade actually has a secondary projectile hit that doubles the damage if it connects with the melee blade as well. Finally, this spell actually applies Frostbite, which means after a few casts it will Frostbite bosses, causing a large chunk of damage and weakening their damage resistance. Gavel of Haima, found with the Cannon of Haima in a tower in northeastern Liurnia, is an excellent panic button spell. It is one of the few spells in the entire game that grants a large amount of hyper armor, causing you to be almost impossible to interrupt except by extremely large attacks. This is a perfect spell to pull out when you're surrounded by small, agile enemies that repeatedly stagger you out of your cast, like dogs, for example. Once the hammer is conjured, very few things can actually interrupt you, and the damage is honestly great. Also note that this spell is also chain castable, as the second gavel will come out decently fast as well. Beware of this spell's high FP cost, however, and I don't recommend using this against large bosses. Cannon of Haima is one of my favorite spells in the entire game. Actually, it's probably my favorite. It shoots a magical fireball mortar in an arcing fashion, allowing you to hit things over walls and in other very creative ways. This spell can be decently hard to use, as you have to unlock and free aim it to hit on target most of the time. I recommend going to the Gatefront site of Grace and just try free aiming at the nearby soldiers to practice. Now, when charged, it does enormous amount of damage in a massive AoE and knocks almost everything down. In PvP, it's also incredibly fun to be on a cliff above players and drop a nuke on them from above. Loretta's Mastery, dropped by the boss of the same name in the Halig Tree, is an extremely expensive but high damaging spell that is difficult to use. It fires 4 missiles in a strange pattern, and if you don't have a clear line of sight, some of these projectiles might actually hit a wall and be wasted. Now, this spell has an extremely long range, allowing you to safely hit very distant enemies given a clear shot. There is also an advanced tech you can do with the spell by aiming directly away from your intended target, and then moving your camera back once you are locked in place. The missiles will always travel to their target, causing them to arc in a pretty fantastic way, possibly going around walls or other obstructions. In PvP, this makes it significantly harder to dodge as the timing changes, and also the spell can come from off-screen. Try to always fully charge the spell for FP efficiency, as it does notably more damage when it is fully charged. Magic Glintblade, purchasable from Dog Pope, sets up a delayed shot projectile in the air. Charging it delays the shot even more and increases its damage. Having a few of these in the air to initiate a fight and charging in when they're all ready to fire can allow you to very quickly shred an enemy down. Interestingly, bosses tend to dodge your initial cast of the spell, not the projectile itself, so it actually ends up being pretty free against agile enemies even at a distance. Shard Spiral, received by siding with Selene at the end of her quest, is an extremely deadly spell against large enemies. The spell fires a slow-moving projectile, but unlike other spells, the projectile does not expire when it hits something. Against small enemies, this pretty much does less damage than a comet, but against large enemies like dragons, this spell, when fully charged, can do upwards of 10,000 damage per cast. It is absolutely one of the best spells in the game for every boss that is above medium-sized. Always try to fully charge this spell to maximize its damage. Terra Magica is a decently useful buff that you place on the ground. It is found at the end of the Academy Crystal Cave and boosts your magic damage when you stand on it. Most bosses won't let you just stand in this, so I recommend this more for specific setups or for preparing giant nuke spells like Loretta's Mastery or Cannon of Haima. The damage increase is pretty substantial, so use it anytime you know you will be able to stand still for a few seconds and need a large spike of damage. In terms of new spells from Shadow of the Erdtree, I don't really recommend any of them. Fleeting Microcosm can be kind of decent, as enemies typically don't dodge the setup, and Impenetrable Thorns is currently game-breakingly broken, but I suspect that it will be heavily nerfed, so I would rather future-proof this guide now. Other than that, all of the base spells can typically do what the DLC spells do, but in a more effective way. Now, there are a few spells you might see that seem popular, but I actually don't recommend. Night Comet is a pretty cheesy spell, as it is part of the class of spells called Night Sorceries. These sorceries are invisible to enemies, and as such, they will not dodge these attacks. This spell does cost a large amount of FP, but it is undeniably cheesy free damage. I don't really recommend this spell because of this, but if you do want some cheap free damage, I can't deny it's really, really strong. Comet is your highest damage spammable spell, and it is found behind an illusory wall in Raya Lucaria. Now, charging the spell makes it more cost efficient, but be warned that Comet does have an extremely high FP cost. If you have the FP to spare or the boss doesn't have much health left, spammed Comets can quickly shred larger enemies that don't dodge projectiles pretty quick. Now, in terms of just spamming it for random PvE enemies, I don't recommend it. It's just too expensive if you have no backup weapon. Comet Azur is frankly a terrible spell. I see this in clips all the time, but it's literally always against the same 3 bosses. There's pretty much no boss in Shadow of the Erdtree you can make Comet Azur cheese one-shot, and the crystal tier that gives you infinite FP to even make this combo work keeps getting nerfed. I honestly don't recommend this spell whatsoever. Now that we have all the spells you'll need, it's time to look at actual gear. One of the most important key items you need are memory stones, which increase the amount of spells you can cast. Now, there are numerous guides on the internet by now. They all involve solving puzzles at various towers across the lands between. You will want to complete all of these and get all 8 memory stones so you can equip 10 spells at once. So complete these towers naturally as you see them in their playthrough. Like, you don't have to go out of your way for it. You'll just run by towers pretty frequently. Just solve the puzzle and get your memory stone there. Next, your crystal tears to put in your Wondrous Physick. These are buffs that will last for 3 minutes, usually far more than enough for any boss fight, to substantially boost your damage. For a majority of the game, you'll be using 2 specifically. The Magic Shrouding Cracked tier, dropped by an Erdtree avatar in northeastern Liurnia, and the Intelligence Not Crystal tier, found sitting on the ground south and below of Carian Manor, guarded by little hands. Now, the former simply makes you do more damage at all times, while the Intelligence tier grants you plus 10 Intelligence, which will be extremely useful for nearly your entire playthrough until you start reaching higher levels above 130, where you can finally hit the soft cap of 80 Intelligence. Once you do hit 80 Intelligence naturally, you can swap this Intelligence tier for something more universally useful, like the Opal and Hard tier for more damage reduction. Before every boss fight, drink your Wondrous Physick with these 2 tiers inside, and you will easily do 30 to 40% more damage for the entire fight. I can't stress how much stronger this Physick setup makes you. Now, for Talismans, there is a specific optimal setup, most of which can be acquired pretty early in the game. By far, the most important talisman you can get this early is Radagon's Icon, found right after the Red Wolf of Radagon in Raya Lucaria. This talisman grants you 30 virtual dexterity. Now, for a quick understanding of what virtual dexterity is, just note that dexterity determines your cast speed, and virtual dexterity is dexterity that applies only to cast speed. For example, if I had a weapon that had a B scaling in dexterity, and I added a point into dexterity, my cast speed would slightly increase and the damage of my weapon would slightly increase. With 1 point of virtual dexterity, only my cast speed would increase. The upside is that items that grant virtual dexterity typically grant an absolutely gargantuan amount of it. Now, the highest cast speed you can have is 70 dexterity, virtual or natural. Considering you will be putting literally nothing into dexterity, all of your cast speed will come from virtual dexterity from items, so the items that grant them are vital. The Graven School Talisman boosts sorcery damage by 4% and is found in Raya Lucaria. It's pretty much a no-brainer for early game, and honestly, it's even fine in late game. The Graven Mass Talisman is the upgraded version, but it also stacks with its weaker partner. It is a little annoying to get, found in the tower in the consecrated snowfields. You'll need some crystal darts or imp summons to solve the tower puzzle there. The Godfrey Icon is a valuable talisman that significantly boosts the damage of charged spells and skills. Considering a lot of spells you'll use can be charged, this is just additional free damage. You'll find this from the shitty Godric reskin right outside the Grand Lift of Dectus in Altus Plateau. The Stargazer Heirloom grants you 5 intelligence, and it's great to throw on early game. As long as you follow Ronnie's questline, you will definitely run into this as well. What about Staves? Considering you will be using no weapons, you're going to want to dual wield Staves. The reason for this is a lot of staves have passive effects on them. For example, the Carian Glintstone staff found at the end of the Carian Study Hall boosts the damage of all Carian sword spells, namely Carian Slicer, Carian Piercer, Adula's Moonblade, and Carian Greatsword by 15%. Now the thing is, you don't have to actually cast with the staff. As long as it's equipped and held in your offhand, you still retain the benefits of its passive effect. The Meteorite staff you've also been using has this same passive benefit for boosting gravity sorcery, namely Rock Sling. Honestly, with how much you'll be casting Carian Slicer, I found the Carian Glintstone staff to just be objectively the best offhand staff, but for PvP, you would probably want to offhand the Azur Glintstone staff, which gives you 40 virtual dexterity. Combined with Radagon's Icon, this actually completely maxes out your cast speed with 0 dexterity investment. If you plan to cheese things with Night Comet, offhanding the Staff of Loss is almost required, as it provides an absolutely massive 30% bonus to night spell damage. When you finally hit around 55 to 60 intelligence, it's time to use an actual main casting tool. Now you have two options, the Carian Regal Scepter or Lusat's Glintstone Staff. Lusat's just has significantly better scaling than the Carian Regal Scepter, but it makes spells cost 50% more FP, which is definitely not something to ignore. I would say until you have at least 35 mind, the Carian Regal Scepter, which is acquired from Anala's Remembrance, is probably the safer option, but I myself use Lusat's, which is a reward from killing the Nox duo in Celia at this intelligence breakpoint and still had plenty of FP. You just can't be chucking expensive spells out left and right and hope to still have enough P to kill bosses, so you can't walk up and just start spamming Comet and stuff like that. You will run out too fast. So now you have your actual staves, talismans, crystal, tears, and spells. All that's left is your actual stats. Now by level 150, you should have 60 vigor, 30 to 40 mind, and 70 or 80 intelligence if you don't want to use the intelligence crystal tier. Your main requirement there is to hit 80 intelligence in any way. The damage difference between even 70 and 80 intelligence is absolutely massive, almost 20%. Now, while leveling, I got to 40 vigor pretty quick and then held off getting 60 until a bit higher levels, around like 100, 110. Mages can play a bit safer than Unga Bunga melee characters and have to trade less, but there's still no excuse not having 60 vigor once you're around level 140 or 150. I still don't know why people call mages glass cannons. They are literally as tanky as any other build, and there's just no reason to not have any vigor. Even 25 or 30 mind is more than sufficient for leveling, so mostly split your stats between vigor and intelligence. Again, every point of intelligence is less spells you need to cast to kill things, effectively granting you more FP. In a nutshell, get to 70 intelligence as quickly as possible while not neglecting your vigor. And as for strength, endurance, and dexterity, you will put your strength to 10, which is the base requirement to use the Carian staff or the Lusat staff. And that's pretty much it. Spare points can be put into endurance at higher levels if you want heavier armor, but spells like Carian Slicer cost so little stamina that you really don't need much of any. Also, a little aside, you can cast spells without meeting the requirement of the casting tool, but for example, if you were to swing a Carian Slicer at an enemy without meeting the requirements and it hit like a shield or something, the staff would bounce off, and you don't want that happening, so just get that 10 strength at the very least. Other random things of note, I would learn to use a claw grip if you play on controller. You'll need to be able to sprint, cast, and also swap spells with the D-pad at the same time. Now remember that holding up on the D-pad cycles to your first spell. I also recommend ordering your spells in such a way that it makes sense. For example, put Terra Magica before Loretta's Mastery and Gavel of Haima, since you'll almost always want to put it on the ground before casting these spells. Spell placement is all personal preference and typically matters a bit more for PvP than PvE. For example, in PvP, I always have Carian Piercer after Carian Slicer because Carian Piercer always roll catches someone that rolls away from Carian Slicer. That being said, just put spells in an order that makes sense for your playstyle, try to find out what you tend to cast in sequence, and then order it that way. Anyway, that's mostly it. Carian Slicer bosses at melee, hit them with comets or swift glintstones at range, shard spiral on large enemies, Carian Piercer to lock down smaller targets. That's the main gameplay loop, which can still be, of course, expanded upon with other spells if you want. This guide would just to help you get the whole pure spellcaster process started. Now, if you followed all of it, you should be starting to feel natural with the setup, and from there you can make your own changes and tweaks as you wish. Hope you enjoyed the guide though, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop by my stream on Twitch. Thanks for watching.